My name is Michael Friedman, and what I've been asked to do this evening is to prepare a presentation that will cover the topic of 3rd Street redevelopment. However, since every single person in this room knows much, much more about 3rd Street than I do, I thought I'd just rename it slightly to ideas that will hopefully be useful in your deliberations about the revitalization or redevelopment of the 3rd Street corridor. What that means is I'm going to not show a single picture of 3rd Street because I'm sure you all know very good urban design and corridor revitalization is based on very thorough field work and knowledge of the site, which I do not have. So if you can get any value out of this for what you would like to do with 3rd Street, it would be by looking at what we have learned in helping communities, property owners, revitalize and redevelop ailing corridors of that type. So I'm going to use examples from other places. A little bit of housekeeping. There will be probably 2 instances during this talk where we will have to do a tape change. And I'm not going to tell you we're doing a tape change so that doesn't have to be edited out. So there will be an awkward silence of some type. And that's what's going on twice. As you all probably know, the subject of corridor revitalization is a very hot subject. 10, 15 years ago, the hottest thing going in our business was probably downtown revitalizations. It's thoroughly been eclipsed by the problems that small, medium-sized cities particularly are having with their commercial corridors, which have been experiencing a lot of disinvestment or very confusing. We give full-day seminars on this topic, so obviously we can't fit everything into 1 hour. So I'd like to get started. So I'm going to just launch right in with your permission. For those of us born before 1960 at least, and maybe later, we can remember that there was a time that all of the commercial development was downtown. And this went on in the downtowns, of course, at the turn of the century, all the way up certainly to the middle of the 20th century. The downtowns were the place where all the stores were, period. So in talking about commercial corridors, we are talking about one form that the commercial centers in our cities and towns has taken. Now, those downtowns that were the only place that the stores were, all the butchers and the bakers and the candlestick makers were there, were all pretty much located on stagecoach lines, as everybody knows. Let's see which thing is my old, or typically on rail corridors where the main thoroughfare in town passed the rail corridor. That's where the downtown would be, the commercial center of the city. Now, somewhere along the line, as the automobile really got going as our way of getting around, as everybody knows, I'm sure, we started developing other large, wide roads to connect the towns. This being one town, let's say, this is an aerial showing a town in the United States of 50,000 people. The yellow being the borders of the town. This is a workshop from a workshop. Now, these roads were initially meant, of course, to connect city to city and allow cars to move quickly and make their way up into the downtown. But the planners of the day started to realize, well, there's a lot of cars on those roads, so why don't we go ahead and zone the land for commercial so that the gas stations and the auto repair and the auto services could go there. But as we all know, the old story is that sooner or later, one of these butchers or bakers or candlestick makers got the bright idea that said, you know, they zoned all that land along those big wide roads commercial, and I'm a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker, so that qualifies. And if I move down there, all those customers are going to see my store before they see any of my competitors. So I'm going to move. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. The butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers pretty much all moved to the big wide corridors. And this has been the form of the corridors where, obviously, we are now not selling. We were not selling any longer to people on foot or driving very, very slowly, but people driving quickly, and the form changed. So, as we all now know, this did not just represent a movement of the commercial centers from downtown to another part of the city, but a completely different form that retailing, of course, took. Rather than having stores opening out onto narrow streets where people would gather on foot, discuss things, and feel a sense of shared territory, everything got changed so that we now, or at the time, shopped in our cars. We typically had to make up our mind what we would buy, go to those places where we decided to go, and then the ground on which those stores were arranged are, of course, ground that is not particularly attractive for walking or bicycling, let alone gathering and feeling a sense of shared territory. So again, the form changed as well as the location. And so in the 1970s particularly, and throughout some of the 1980s in various cities and towns, a big war happened between the commercial corridors and the downtowns. And where that war happened, the downtowns pretty much all lost. And families and singles and seniors, people looking for something convenient, people looking for a sit-down restaurant, didn't matter what it was, you would now find yourself standing in the parking lot, having a chat there perhaps, but shopping on the commercial corridor. So there we found that, as we all know, there was disinvestment out of the old downtown corridors, which moved out onto these linear commercial corridors. Very old story. And so the downtowns, particularly some of the side streets and the paralleling streets to the main commercial main streets or the downtown 100% locations, started to show very severe signs of disinvestment and blight. Enter now a more recent period of the development of the commercial strip. We began to see and have begun to see that now the commercial strip has very strongly entered quietly a completely second phase of its evolution. And that is an evolution where there is an increasing concentration of retail power at major intersections, anchored and not anchored. Some of the most powerful concentrations, of course, as we all know, are anchored by big box and superstore retail, itself a very recent phenomenon and almost entirely located on commercial corridors. So what that did, as we all know, is it continued to exacerbate the flight of investment from the downtown. And that is the story we read about in the papers, where that put the finishing touches on downtown. And that's when we started to see, particularly in the early 90s, a tremendous amount of fear of anybody trying to do business in a downtown who loved a downtown. So that's the downtown story that everybody knows. While all that was going on, a much, much, much more overlooked phenomenon was also happening that cities are only now waking up to. And that is that not only did these new concentrations at major intersections drain the rest of the remaining value from many downtowns, but possibly more damaging and much less noticed is that this started to drain the old commercial strips as well as all of the segments in between major intersections of value. And so what we started finding was the old form of the commercial strip, which did very well for a while at the expense of downtown, was now starting to compete with major concentrations, as we all know, at freeway interchanges, immense concentrations at freeway interchanges, anchored concentrations at major intersections, unanchored power centers at major intersections, you know, where we all shop now. And so one can go back and look where there were department stores, as well as little collections of retail and other specialty centers that are no longer at major intersections, and see for the first time, city to city, tremendous amounts of vacancy and loss of value. This is an old Montgomery Ward's, right in the wrong location. Very strong store at one time. So we see tremendous amounts of disinvestment now happening out there where no one was looking, in between the major intersections and on all of the old commercial corridors, creating blight, creating disinvestment, dislocations, safety problems, and all the rest of it. Now, the most vulnerable of the folks who have an ongoing venture out there on the corridor, now that retail is collecting in greater and greater concentrations at major intersections, are the folks who are out there by themselves with their own 1 or 2 or 3 businesses, with their own sign, with their own parking lot, with their own building, with their own marketing, not sharing parking, not sharing customers, not sharing visibility, in the middle of things, having done well once, and now dying off in some communities slow, in some communities quickly. Even those medium-sized centers that are not anchored or that are not at major intersections are also getting devastated, again slowly or quickly. So that now we have, in many towns, Bend included, segments of once thriving commercial corridors which are now showing for the first time in their evolution as a phenomenon as a commercial center, if you will, of our cities, showing severe signs of disinvestment, and communities are now trying to figure out what to do, and there are very few precedents. Now, in all of the projects, for the most part, that we have successfully revitalized or redeveloped corridors, there are some, I mean, every city is very different, and every solution is very different, but there are some things that we have found that are quite common to many of these disinvested corridors. And one of the most important elements of these solutions that now dates back to, I think, the first time we did one of these about 13, 14 years ago in the city of San Leandro, California, we began to realize that these, let's say these little red asterisks or those little stores all by themselves, or the stores not at the major intersections where retail is concentrating. And they're out there by themselves, not sharing signage, not sharing marketing, not sharing parking, not sharing customers. This kind of pattern is dying. And this pattern can typically only be revitalized by being replaced by a pattern in which the retail is clustered in the right locations, and where long segments, formerly all commercial, formerly all retail eating, entertainment. Let's use the retail to mean those uses that generate a lot of coming and going. Retail, restaurant, theater, art gallery, personal service, business service, and entertainment uses. Just call them retail or shopping, just for shortcuts, so I don't have to say that long list every time. So the retail out there by itself is not working anymore. It needs to be concentrated. That leaves long flanks in between major intersections that need to be re-envisioned by the community as an exciting kind of a place that would be market realistic and change. Similarly, we will see that the form of the corridor has to change in order to respond to a new way of distributing land use. Now, one of the most gratifying things that's happened for us since we were very early in getting going on this corridor revitalization, not through any insights, just because somebody asked us to figure out what to do with a problem one long time ago, we were very gratified to see that the ULI has finally come out with a small pamphlet to address this huge growing problem of particularly suburban cities. And I think their most useful point and their most powerful point is the one I just made, but it's nice to see it verified by ULI, which is an organization, of course, that we respect very much. And there you see it, prune back the retail zone land. So lesson one from our experience in doing this is typically commercial corridors are just that. They are now, in this new phase that they have entered, overzoned for commercial, more particularly overzoned for retail. Now let's take a look at a practical example and how this plays out. This is one community where, in this case, the city brought us in to figure out what to do with a corridor the economics are stagnating, and the community is very unhappy because it's a very high quality community, but like most commercial strips, they're not just places for shopping, they're usually the main or one of the main arterials in the city. That means everybody who passes through town that doesn't live there assembles in their minds their sense of the identity of that community based on what they see when they drive through the arterial. So in this particular community, the arterial is the one really ugly part of town, and the rest of town's gorgeous. But the identity of the whole town is suffering. And so what they wanted to do was fix the economics and fix the identity as quickly as possible. So this is a 7 miles of commercial corridor. In this particular city, it's the only major arterial. So the whole world sees this city when they pass through this 7 miles right on that corridor. As you might expect, when you map the building footprints and the uses in those building footprints out there, you get what you usually find in a commercial corridor today. You get a hodgepodge of uses. In general, the community thinks of it as one long shopping strip. If you look closely, you will find that the red is retail, for example, and it's not 100% retail by any means. But when you look at it, that's the way it feels. Dominated by signs, dominated by curb cuts, plenty of economic power, which makes sense since 30, 40,000 cars a day are going by, which is the size of a small city. So lots of customers right there, ready to be picked off if you have a good sign and something good to offer. So that's what we had to work with. Now, if you turn the existing conditions into a kind of cartoon of itself, or boil it down to its essence, what you'll find is fairly typical. You have a skinny strip of land going through the city where the residential, which is these yellow things, which are the borders of neighborhoods, come very close up to the edge of the land that's zoned for commercial. In fact, it's zoned for every form of commercial, from veterinarians to auto repair to Walmart. Everything under the sun, as long as it's not housing, is allowed on this strip. And what has happened is there are some concentrations on large, deep properties, a mall property, a power center property. There's auto sales and various forms of commercial. And then there are areas that just seem like it's not really clear what they are, but there's a fair amount of disinvestment with interspersed successful retail. So the question became how to really wake this up, revitalize it, and change the identity for the community. How to apply this idea to begin with, the idea of responding to the realities of the economies of scale happening in the marketplace of retail, which are now mandating that really this retail has got to be at a major intersection. In applying that to that, this is sort of the diagram from the workshops of a revitalization strategy to take something that feels like it goes all the way around the equator, right, without stopping, without any identity change, without any use change, to turn it into something that is a series of segments, where each segment has a strong identity and a strong market focus, where it can be more successful in bringing in investment of a certain type, and where it can begin to distinguish itself in terms of how it looks and how it works and how it performs economically. So in this case, this being a very long one, a 7-mile corridor, each of these little sort of cartoon circles represents a different segment in our strategy. You will also see that rather than having the neighbors, in many cases, rather than the neighborhoods just sort of edging up to the corridor, the idea of bringing some of the uses that are already in the community out on display so that the high quality of residential Whittier, in this case, can be displayed right out there on the roadway. So in this case, we have a long segment which we're calling a neighborhood spine. We have a segment which is dominated by auto sales and services. We have the shopping cluster where the retail is all being clustered. We have a workplace center, and we have a gateway segment. Now, obviously, that needs to be boiled down so that it actually corresponds to the real parcelization happening on the corridor, and so that rather than having what every community has today, which is one set of zoning for the entire 7 miles, now what we've done is we've rewritten the zoning so it's completely different for each segment. So each segment has zoning that supports a much more focused set of uses that the market can respond to in a much more responsive way, so that the first job, which is I think very important to realize, is this is something that a developer cannot do, a property owner cannot do. The assembly of what all the puzzle pieces should be when it's finished and successful is something that only the powers of a community, of the city, can be used to revitalize or to redevelop, to begin the redevelopment of the corridor. So then, of course, each one of these segments corresponds to a series of very specific rules about use and setback and orientation and everything else. Now, let's take a closer look. Beginning with the retail segment. As we said before, it now feels like a 7-mile retail segment. We have now recommended, based on a market study, we first said, well, how much retail, given all the growth that we expect in the city, and given the amount that's out there now, and given all the people that are there now and their disposable income and who they are and all the rest of it, what is the absolute most amount of retail that we can support in this location? This is a city without a freeway interchange, by the way. Based on that, we added a little, right? We don't want to overly constrain the retail. And we ended up with about 1.2 miles for a segment, which is actually this big, right? So what used to feel like 7 miles of one thing, well, now the retail will need to cluster in this area right here, which means from a zoning standpoint, and this is the hard part, we will remove retail entitlements except for residential serving retail or office serving retail, depending on the segment. We will remove many retail entitlements from all these properties and replace them with other entitlements, which are not as lucrative, by the way, so that's politically very, very controversial in any state, and concentrate those retail entitlements, particularly for comparison retail, certain forms of specialty retail, regional retail, in this 1.2 miles. which has shallow parcels, medium-sized parcels, and very deep parcels. Now, what form should that retail take? Let's first take a look at the large-scale segments. In order to figure out how can the corridor come back and be immensely successful, because it should obviously be the most successful commercial place in the city. That's the place with the visibility and all the people really close. It's the place with the convenience. Thousands and tens of thousands of people going by. Shouldn't be too hard. Now, in order to figure out what to do with the large parcels on the corridor, we have learned that it's wise to follow what are the trends going on in the industry at the end where the industry, in terms of regional retail centers, are the most successful. So let's just back up and talk about this for a sec. You can probably all remember there was a time when the regional retail centers was started as actually regional malls, pretty much looked like this. Whatever mall you had in your town, if it was built particularly in the 70s or the early 80s, you could probably show a slide of it and offer $1 million to anybody in the room to tell you where it was. And no one ever would be able to, because they all look the same. God, okay, give me $1 million. Where's this? It's still there? $1 million. Okay, see what I mean? Now, what happened was the market got overbuilt. And so developers began to respond to that by trying to distinguish one center from another. And so what we got was, we got a facelift on the outside. And there were all kinds of these, and you probably saw this happen in your travels and here and the rest of it. So they all started looking different. And what the retail developers learned was that it was money down the drain, didn't do anything. The same competition was going on. Customers learned pretty quickly that it was just a facelift on the outside. Obviously, we don't pick our malls for which one has a more Spanishy look to it. We pick our malls for what are the anchors to begin with, how far do I have to walk from my parking space, and how close is it to where I work or live. Now, since that time, though, everything has changed. A tremendous amount of investment has gone into building new and totally rebuilt regional centers in which a tremendous amount of amenity is put into the centers, and where that amenity is laid out in such a way that feels almost like a downtown. In other words, we are seeing indoor-outdoor retailing that is wonderful for the pedestrian's experience. Much more expensive finish on these buildings, a tremendous amount of money being put into things that we never even spent any money on regional centers, having to do with the amenities and the open spaces in these centers, and they're taking many different forms. This is one in Massachusetts by the name of Mashpee Commons, where you can see that even though it really is a regional center with huge parking lots, right? When you get to the front doors of the stores actually form a Main Street-like environment, right? These are not separate parcels or anything else. This is a typical regional center, but the form is such that people can actually park on street. It feels like a series of small blocks. You can walk from store to store, and just like in the old downtowns, the parking is screened by the buildings in the back. Although when you arrive on the arterial, you are in fact facing the parking lots. So it is an interesting hybrid between old and new. But okay, so whether you're looking at the City Walks, the Rodeo 2s, the Meisner Parks, the Santana Rows, the Mashpee Commons, all of these share certain brand new things in common. That's the amount of money put into public space, public greens, public streets, the facing of the buildings towards the streets, the clustering of the buildings in a tight cluster, the creation of a wonderful pedestrian realm, and the screening of the parking or the structuring of the parking, depending on the land values. This is very unique also, something we never used to see. This is a post office, so we're starting to see public buildings creep their way into the regional centers. This is just another one. This is Cabazon. There you see the parking lot facing the arterial. You move out of the parking lot through this portal, and this is where most of the shopping takes place. Again, a very pedestrian-oriented, urban, if you will, kind of a setup. These are all very much in learning from or copying what really is the best of our old downtowns, where we have a tremendous amount of variety that makes you want to walk and explore in these centers. But they're not downtowns, they are in fact malls. So the difference between why people love these and what these were has informed and completely transformed how we are now planning regional centers. We are planning regional centers nothing like this anymore, and entirely like this. And so the regional centers are completely taking apart places like what do you call it, South Park, where the downtown is absolutely, in fact, South Park is probably the only city that called my firm up to for problems in the downtown. And the only city that's ever called up, we said, well, what is the problem? And they said, well, we're very worried about our downtown. It's too successful, and we're worried it's going to be trampled out of existence. That's the kind of problem, really, that most downtowns would kill for. So you find developers who are interested now in revitalizing their retail, making the trek up to South Park and other places like this, to Santa Fe, for example, and other places, and literally taking apart what is it that makes this place feel so good. And what they learn, as you all know, is they learn that, well, it's the opposite of what this thing was, right? What it has is ground floor retail and restaurant and theater and entertainment and art galleries and personal and business services with a door that opens directly onto a public street or a green or a promenade or a way. And it has transparent windows, welcoming entrances, so people don't have to feel like they have to make a big decision whether to go in and out. They can just feel that that ground floor is public. And most importantly, every 20, 25 feet or so, there's a door and a window, and the shop front changes its composition in those kinds of places, so that the person moving at walking speed is kept interested. Now, you might be looking at this slide and say, you know, that's kind of an ugly place. That's right. But the sales here are now up to $400 a square foot, which shows you a funny thing, which is the first rule in really revitalizing a retail place and learning from the great downtowns is not necessarily having buildings that win beauty contests to begin with. It has to do with actually making a form that will keep this potential customer walking and exploring. Now that can be done in a way, if you're smart, like this one, where this is all one property developed by one developer, and it looks a whole lot nicer than the other one, and it is also nearly up at $400 a square foot in sales. But you can see the same thing going on. Window door, window door, window door, welcoming entrances, change every 20 to 25 feet. 18 is even better in the composition of the facade. So of course, when you are on that street, and you are walking down that street, and you look inside this window and you don't see anything you want to buy, there's something about this physical arrangement that's almost like it whispers in your ear. It says, just take 3 more steps and there'll be something new to look at, something new you might want to buy. So in other words, even though this particular smart retail developer bought all this and developed it all at once, did they put one long awning across here, a nice big green awning that says, this is my project? No, they didn't. They created, look at just the awnings. Awnings seemingly at random intervals, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, signage the same, architecture the same, cladding the same, base the same, doors, windows, everything made different to create that variety that makes you want to get out of your car and explore, and pulls you down the street and pulls the money out of your pocket. Which is why in those kinds of areas it is essential that communities understand these relationships and do things to make sure that the ground level is put together in a way that will keep sales per square foot very high, which does very simple things. It means you can't put in, you must disallow in that ground floor of your regional center that's learning from the downtowns, disallow long runs of blank frontage where you want the pedestrians to roam. Not